one that has had special prominence in East Asia, although it works, throughout the Mahayana Buddhist world, like Northern Buddhism. It was translated from Sanskrit, the language it was originally written down in. Sanskrit is kind of like Latin is for us. It's the liturgical, classical language, no longer spoken. I mean, it's preserved in India in that way, but no longer popularly spoken. And was translated from Sanskrit to Chinese by a man named Kumarajiva. And there's so much that we are learning about the transmission of Buddhism from India, the land of its birth, to other countries, and in this case, China. It went around the Himalayas, like through Afghanistan and Pakistan, along trade routes, hooked into the Silk Road, the road that Marco Polo took, and then all the way over to China. Kumaragila, good Buddhist Sanskrit name, you'd think he'd be, Indian, but he wasn't. He was Khotanese. There are all these Central Asian cultures and nations that don't exist anymore. But he was in Khotan, and he was this tremendous scholar, eventually made his way to China and translated numbers of sutras. And these would be like teams of like 400 scholars working under him, a tremendous kind of cultural accomplishment. But nonetheless, translated it into Chinese, and then eventually that was first printed book in the world. So it figures in very significant ways, and I'm sure George is going to tell us.
Well, I have a copy of the book about the finding of the sutra, and the sutra it's circulating about. So feel free to take a look at that.
So yes, please make yourself comfortable wherever you like. And thank you, George, for doing this, and take it away.
Well, no, shall we have opening prayers? Just a short
Sure.
refuge prayer?
Sure. Pull the book. I think it's on page 11. Yeah, we'll do it in English. The transliterated Tibetan is on page 10, but nonetheless. In the Buddha, Dharma, and assembly excellent, I take refuge till I come to full awakening. By the merit of my deeds like generosity, may I achieve Buddhahood for being's benefit. In the Buddha, Dharma, and assembly excellent, I take refuge till I come to full awakening. By the merit of my deeds like generosity, may I achieve Buddhahood for being's benefit. In the Buddha, Dharma, and assembly excellent, I take refuge till I come to full awakening. By the merit of my deeds like generosity, may I achieve Buddhahood for being's benefit. May all mother sentient beings equal to space have happiness and the cause of happiness. May they be free of suffering and the cause of suffering. May they not be separated from the happiness free of suffering. May they abide in equanimity, free of attachment and aversion to near and far. May all mother sentient beings equal to space have happiness and the cause of happiness. May they be free of suffering and the cause of suffering. May they not be separated from the happiness free of suffering. May they abide in equanimity, free of attachment and aversion to near and far. May all mother sentient beings equal to space have happiness and the cause of happiness. May they be free of suffering and the cause of suffering. May they not be separated from the happiness free of suffering. May they abide in equanimity, free of attachment and aversion to near and far.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you all for coming. This is wonderful to see. some old familiar faces and some new familiar faces and some really, really familiar faces here. Um, as Frank mentioned, this is part of my thesis requirement for the end of my degree studies at Union Theological Seminary. I'm doing a degree in a Master's of Divinity in Interreligious Engagement and Buddhism with a chaplaincy sort of minor. I think it's important to talk a little bit about why I'm here, because it speaks to, for me, it speaks to why these sutras and why this work is important. I think anything that is altruistic or anything that is good or anything that seeks to take us outside of ourselves sometimes begins with the realization that, you know, that we're suffering. And when we suffer, we watch other people suffer. And sometimes it's just a little bit too much to bear. My deciding to take the degree at Union was born of a number of things. One, I always wanted to, the minute it opened up, I thought, oh my goodness, this is something I would really like to do. But unfortunately, or fortunately, COVID made that possible. And so with COVID, it was the idea of being able to go to school could manifest because most of the classes were online. And then, would you know, they found a remedy, some sort of remedy for COVID, and the classes went back online. And I spent last year in New York City fulfilling my, my residency requirement and doing 5 classes each semester. I went there initially thinking, oh, I'll be back in New York, my hometown, yada, 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 it'll be great. I basically existed within a 5-block radius because of the amount of work. There was really not much time to do anything. So the title of this thesis is actually the Vajrachedika Prajnaparamita Sutra, or the Diamond Sutra, or the Diamond that Cuts Through Illusion, or the Diamond Cutter Sutra. Depends on which translation you read. And I had as in my topic as Black Liberation Theology, a personal perspective and interpretation. I'm going to limit some of that somewhat tonight to a more generalized kind of perspective, but yet still personal. So when I say personal perspective, I will not be sort of giving a monk's knowledge of this Dharma and this sutra. One of the illuminating factors of studying this sutra was that as I was reading it and as I was studying it, I got as far as the first 2 chapters and I went, oh my gosh, this is going to take me a few lifetimes. And that's the reality of the sutra. It's an incredibly dense, opaque, layered, it's sort of like an uber Russian doll. You know, with a Russian doll married to an Escher woodblock, you know, layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of meaning. And so to even scratch the surface of the sutra, I think would take a lot of doing. So I decided to sort of restrict myself to the first 2 chapters or first 2 paragraphs, because for me, they contain the essence of the sutra, of the entire sutra. And not unlike a lot of Buddhist works, whenever we meet the Buddha and we meet the Sangha, we are already learning something just through meeting them. So my welcome. Why such a small part of the sutra? I just told you. The immensity of the undertaking. Can anyone see my head bursting? So, you know, for me, this is part of an ongoing lifetime pursuit, not only to learn more about the sutra, but what I'll be talking about mostly is making the sutra manifest in my life. Because that's what we do. You know, I'm not Tibetan. I did not live at the time of the Buddha, and I do not take on all the accoutrements of that time. However, being a human being, most of it's relevant to me. So I think I'll begin with a personal story, just a little bit of a personal story, because I think it sheds some light on why the sutra is important to me and why I chose it. And it's really just a paragraph or so. It's not going to be this huge cathartic, woe is me. So my life has been full of rude awakenings, like all of ours. As a young child raised in the South Bronx during the height of the 60s, think multiple gangs and gang wars, junkies, drug dealers, pimps, degradation of housing and schools, etc. My mother's sole job, this seemed, was to make my fear of her stronger than the fear of anything going on in the streets. The constant beatings from my mother, being chased and brutally beaten by junkies and street gangs, not always having enough to eat, the infrequency of having sufficient heat or gas, plus being frail and asthmatic, would seem to be a recipe for despair and hopelessness. But due to my mother's insistence on education and self-reliance, I inhabited a mode of resiliency crafted not only for maximum survival, but also learning to thrive. Thus, no mud, no lotus. So that's my personal story, and we'll come back to that in a second. I want to talk for a second about translation and interpretation, because when we talk about, there are at least, all of these books here are the Diamond Sutra. Okay, just the Diamond Sutra. So you have Thich Nhat Hanh, the diamond that cuts through illusion. You have Hui Ning. Now, this is an interesting story. Hui Ning was a student of Bodhidharma who was thought to have brought Buddhism to China. And Bodhidharma was thought to be the person who created wall sitting and gazing, etc. And was an interesting guy. He sort of went about China pissing off everyone. But at any rate, Hui Ning was heard of, was this poor Chinese, was he a merchant?
Illiterate.
He was illiterate,
Yeah.
but he heard the Diamond Sutra being preached in the streets and gained enlightenment instantly. Now, see, he heard of Bodhidharma and he begged Bodhidharma to be his teacher, and Bodhidharma kept saying no, no, no. And it is said, though, I think it's been disproved somehow, that in order to prove how serious he was, he cut off his arm so that he could prove to Bodhidharma how serious he was about studying with him. At any rate, so this is Hui Ning's commentary on the Diamond Sutra. You have one of my favorites, the Red Pine commentary on the Diamond Sutra, and this is very, very readable from most of the books that I have here. We have Mu Xiong Diamond Sutra, Chinese Buddhist master, also very academic. We have the only book that I could find by a Tibetan master, Dzogchen Master Khenpo Sodarje, and his version of the Diamond Cutter Sutra. This is really interesting. Your Mind at Siege. This is a book that was written from a podcast on the Diamond Sutra, and talks about exploring the conundrum of consciousness, artificial intelligence through the lens of the Diamond Sutra. So if you want to wet your, actually it's extremely interesting, and I'll see, if you get to read my thesis, you'll actually see more of that in there. And then, of course, sort of the standard bearer, the Kanzi, the Diamond Sutra, and the Heart Sutra, Edward Kanzi, who was one of the first sort of, if you will, did some of the earliest commentaries on Buddhist Sutra. So with that, you have many, many different interpretations, including those of the chapters of the sutra. And I just decided I won't go through the entire list, but in the uh, Kempo Sodarje, in the first 5 chapters you have the cause of this teaching, Subhuti asks questions, the genuine great vehicle, the wonderful practice without fixation, the true meaning, etc. In the Thich Nhat Hanh version, you have, as chapter 1, the setting. Subhuti's question, that seems not to be different. The first flash of lightning, the greatest gift, and signlessness. Where did any of that come from? That the first one has nothing like that related. And then in the Thomas Cleary, the Hui Ning, we have the cause and the reason of the teaching assembly. Subhuti initiates questioning, the true source of the great vehicle, subtle practice without dwelling, and real seeing in accord with truth. Could they not be more different? So I cite that as kind of validation of my taking these chapters and totally turning them on their head a little bit, which I will do later. And so, sort of in the scholarly question I ask is, or poses, the wonders and vagaries of human communication often center on subtleties of language and interpretation that are not ubiquitous in all our human cultures. While emotional responses to pain, joy, suffering are universal and easily understood, the often complex ideas and misunderstandings resulting from poor translation obfuscate and make opaque layers of nuance and meaning inherent in most world languages. Add to this how concepts and ideas are adapted and changed, often away from their originally contextualized meaning, as they are exposed to different cultures. The mystery and opaqueness of Buddhism in general, and the Vajrayana in specific, is rife with these things. So why the Black liberation context? We'll talk about that in a second. So interpretation, as a classical musician, most people know I'm a classical musician, and we teach, there are various interpretations of any one piece of music. You can go to a Mozart violin concerto and you can have Hilary Hahn playing it, and then you can have Yehudi Menuhin playing it, and David Oistrakh and Jascha Heifetz, and musicians will argue over who has the best interpretation. But meanwhile, they're all playing Mozart. So for me, interpretation is how I make relevant this music to my life. So when I'm playing the Allemand from a Bach suite, I'm not thinking of the chordal structure, how Bach wrote sacred music, the fact that this key has this sort of affect and has these feelings. I go through all of that and his time and period, and then I go, okay, what does this mean to me? And instantly appears Radio Rahim with a ghetto blaster, holding it to his head, just kind of jamming down the street, going bum 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 ba da da dum bum bum ba da dum bum bum ba da dum bum bum, and he's having a great old time with this music. And so this we do this thing of contextualization all the time, and creating meaning from things that are old and new. And in so much as this is a paper about a very old sutra, it's also an invitation. It's an invitation to take the things that we learn and not only utilize them in our lives in sort of general ways, but in ways that where we really, really think about how it affects other people, our relationship to those other peoples, and how it enriches our lives. So As a classically trained violist and pedagogue, I understand and teach that original, intelligent, extra musical, and potent interpretive skills are the mark of a true artist. I'm speaking here of the standard classical music canon of dead white composers. Music written in between the 12th and 21st centuries is constantly given new life and relevance to the insights and skills of talented artists who make the music live in the moment. Doing this requires the ability to blend historical reference, compositional style, theoretical knowledge, and marry these with insights gleaned from contemporary culture and lived experience. My personal interpretation of this sutra is forged by my life experience, incomplete knowledge of the Dharma, and the wish and actions I have hopefully manifested somewhat, most of my life, to be a benefit to all sentient beings. I will not even come close to extrapolating and understanding the teaching of this sutra. That would take several lifetimes, as I've mentioned. In studying just a fragment of this sutra, I have come away with insights and revelatory connections to my life, my experience, and my relationship to all sentient beings. Now, I was going to add here a primer dependent on who was in the audience and just sort of say, well, who is the Buddha? But I'm not going to do that because most of you have some idea of who the Buddha was. And so, and that's not going in my paper, but I just thought if I had students, a number of students here, that I might go through that. So the sutra and the history, the Vajrachedika Prajna Paramita, the perfection of wisdom that cuts like a thunderbolt. So we need a little bit of a glossary, right? Prajna Paramita is the perfection of wisdom. And it is part of a series of sutras that are from 8,000 to 10,000 lines in length, written between the 2nd century BC and 3rd century AD. This sutra, the Diamond Sutra, possibly precedes the other Prajna Paramita Sutras text because Subhuti, who is the one who is asking the questions, here is teaching for the first time, and this fact does not occur in the other sutras. An early Chinese translation of this sutra printed in 868 AD is the earliest dated printed book ever written, preceding the Gutenberg Bible, printed in 1455, and thought to be the earliest printed book by quite a few years. It was commissioned by Wang Ji, who most people don't, no one knows who he was. And he wrote at the end of the scroll, reverently made for universal free distribution by Wang Ji on behalf of his 2 parents. Welcome to the 21st century. Go online, download the sutra. It is absolutely free. Today, that scroll is housed in the British Library and is acknowledged as the oldest dated printed book in existence. So what does this sutra teach? It teaches shunyata, or what we call emptiness. It teaches skillful means, upaya, the perfection of wisdom. It teaches and encourages wisdom and provokes concepts of reality and self. It teaches transcending dualities, veneration of Buddhist relics, cultivation of mind, non-attachment, oh, that's a good one for me, karma and merit, ultimate reality, universal applicability, and mindfulness and awareness. So that's a lot if you really think about it. And when we think of all of these things, we think of the Bodhisattva. And the other thing that the sutra is, foremost and mostly, is a guide to the Bodhisattva path. And we're going to spend a little time talking about the Bodhisattva, because I think it has a lot of meaning. Not only does it have a lot of meaning to me, but I want it to have a lot of meaning to you. What is the Bodhisattva? A Bodhisattva is the person who vows to remain, whatever that means, for as long as it takes until all sentient beings achieve full realization. Some scriptures say nirvana. I'm going to say full realization for now. Let's get to the first chapter of the sutra right away. Ah, yes. Okay. 1. Thus have I heard, once the Bhagavan was dwelling near Shavasti at Anapathapandita garden in Jeddah forest, together with the full assembly of 1,250 bhikkhus and a great many fearless bodhisattvas. One day before noon, the Bhagavan put on his patched robe and picked up his bowl and entered the capital of Shavasti for offerings. After begging for food in the city and eating his meal of rice, he returned from his daily round in the afternoon, put his robe and bowl away, washed his feet, and sat down on the appointed seat. After crossing his legs and adjusting his body, he turned his awareness to what was before him. A number of bhikshus then came up to where the Bhagavan was sitting. After touching their heads to his feet, they walked around him on the right 3 times and sat down to one side. Oh boy. Okay. Now, we'll come back to a lot of that, and I'll just sort of go through a short glossary of some terms that were used there. So a Bhagavan, I don't know how many of you are familiar with that term, but a Bhagavan is derived from Bhaga or Sanskrit, which is for vulva, which means fecund or prosperous, one whose presence shows prosperity. The Tathagata is a Pali word, one who has thus gone, or one who has thus come, or one who has thus not gone. Are we confused yet? Or beyond coming and going. An arhat or anhat is one who has gained insight into the true nature of existence, and a bodhisattva, a person who is on the path toward awakening or Buddhahood. Who is the Bhuti? His name, he is the one who asks all the questions in this sutra. And his name means good existence. He is one of the 10 principal disciples of the Buddha. He's a central figure in the Prajnaparamita Sutras, and he had a preeminent understanding of sunyata, which is emptiness. We'll talk a little bit about that. It's good to know that the other famous monks cited in Buddhist Sutra are Sariputra, who was Buddha's first chief disciple, and he was dubbed General of the Dharma because of his ability to teach, and Ananda, who was his first cousin and was dubbed the treasurer of the Dharma. Nirvana. So this is something that most lay people don't understand. They think Nirvana means heaven or the rock band. And so a technical translation of nirvana might be the extinguishing of passions, which is the ultimate state of soteriological, and soteriological is the beliefs or doctrines containing salvation, relief from dukkha, which is suffering. So nirvana is basically release from suffering. And I like to mention that because a lot of my friends will come, well, that's the Buddhist heaven. And I will go, no. Let's see, when you're eating a piece of fresh fruit and the sun is shining and it's beautiful and people are laughing and joking and the sun is warm and you feel good, isn't that nirvana? Isn't that heaven? Would you really want to go in a place that has, pardon me, forgive me, Jerry Falwell in it? So at any rate, the idea that heaven or nirvana is this other place with like-minded people who are only Buddhist is incorrect. Nirvana is this place where we can all be where we have ultimate realization of reality. One could opine that the entire teaching of this sutra resides in this opening, for in it there are references to earlier teachings of non-duality, the Bodhisattva path, the elimination of attachment, and the subjugation of the mind, which is called ultimate bodhicitta, or there is no sentient being liberated. Characteristics of the true Buddha, Bodhisattva, the practice of generosity without fixating on any phenomena. And it is important to understand the Bodhisattva path and vow, for it's none other than the solemn responsibility we have to all beings, codifying the path to liberation. So now I'm going to peel back the Russian doll here just on chapter 1. Thus have I heard. That's as far as we'll get for a minute. Believe it or not, underneath that, believe it or not, there have been books written about those 4 words, stemming from books about the language and the translation from Sanskrit to Pali, and yada, 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 and how extent it is throughout the sutras, and is it exclusive or not to certain sutras and certain teachings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, thus have I heard an invitation to connect with the ancestors. That's my interpretation. Thus have I heard seems a somewhat inane phrase to focus on, but these 4 words contain a depth and wealth of meaning. Being immersed in present moment by thus have I heard, I was there. In relationship with thus have I heard. Tied to direct experience, thus have I heard. And lastly, received in the Buddha's presence, thus have I heard. It is a seal of authenticity, such as, back in the day when I was a little lad, when I was a young woman, when the dinosaurs roamed the earth in a galaxy far, far away. Setting the stage for narrative is an essential part of the teaching process. How it will be heard and perceived is dependent on the authenticity of its origin. Trusted sources elicit attention and respect, inviting the listener as if they were part of and privy to something important and meaningful. The setting of place and those attending and participating give us an idea of the importance of this occasion. In ending, thus I have heard is more than an opening phrase. It is an invitation. It can elicit feelings of warmth, familiarity, trust, and safety. And I love it because when now I'm going to just sort of wax philosophically for a second, or speak extemporaneously. And I remember my mother telling stories of, she was part Seminole, and she would talk about being on the reservation, and she would talk about learning how to cook, and she would talk about learning how to throw a knife, and I got to watch her throw a knife into a wall, and it was like, okay. I got to think also of my Roman Catholic upbringing and how in awe I was of the church, and what an incredible mystery there was until the Mass came out in Latin, and then all of a sudden it was in English, and I went, "That what you talking about?" Mm-hmm. But this idea that the opening of something, the opening of a Mass, the opening of a song, can elicit and is an invitation. It's an invitation to place. It is a lost art, and we'll talk about that later. In the monastery in Anathapindika's part in the Jeta Grove near Shravasti, with a community of 1,250 bhikkhus, fully ordained monks. A number of bhikkhus then came up to where the Bhagavan was sitting, After touching their heads to his feet, they walked around him on the right 3 times and sat down to one side. And in chapter 2 it goes, on this occasion the Venerable Subhuti was also present in the assembly. Rising from his seat, he uncovered one shoulder and touched his right knee to the ground, pressing his palms together and bowing to the Buddha. Here we have ritual. And ritual is another lost art. The 1,250 bhikkhus, monks, and the setting of Jeddah Grove are people and location representative of our spiritual ancestry as Buddhist. But they are not the only spiritual tether forged in our ancestral DNA. Honoring ancestors is a somewhat lost or diminished aspect of cultural life in America. From Ayn Rand to Mark Twain, the American ideal is based on the rugged individual with a can-do attitude. In his article, American Individualism Reconsidered, Eric Mount Jr. notes that individualism is in many ways our myth and our religion, our ethos and our ethic. And he traces a lot of this ethos to what he calls a distinctive American ideology, to the formation of a unique American identity connecting politics, economics, and religion in the post-colonial states. He also cites a noted scholar, Alfred Kazin, who describes the American Revolution's most noted effect as to create and perpetuate our secular religion, the free individual. Using arguments from prominent scholars, Mount maintains that individualism is a central part of the American identity and I put in bold, wields power over every aspect of American life. So why do I mention this in regards to, after touching their heads to his feet, they walked around him 3 times and sat down to one side. This idea of paying homage to anything is sort of an anathema in our culture. It's sort of like a prove it to me culture. We need proof that this will be of some use to me before I can actually use it. On this occasion, the Venerable Subhuti was also present. Rising from his seat, he uncovered one shoulder. So what is that act of uncovering one shoulder? It is not only an act of veneration, it's an act of vulnerability. I am standing before you partially naked for you to teach me. I am an empty vessel. I am here. He touched his right knee to the ground, pressed his palms together, and bowing to the Buddha. I won't mention things like Bibles being sold for $60, etc., but the kinds of venerations that we see nowadays are kind of an anathema to our understanding of what true veneration is. True veneration is screaming when your grandmother and grandfather come in the door and them taking you on their knee and telling you stories and eliciting stories from you. True veneration is being present for someone who is in pain and who is suffering, and not giving them great advice, but just being there and listening, creating a space for people to be with you and around you. I personally feel that this is the kind of thing that needs to be brought back and exists in these sutras, and I would love to teach. I go on with, the propensity towards I and me is the antithesis to the grounding and liberatory catharsis of community, liberation, and what Buddhists call dharma dhatu, the purified mind in its natural state, or realm of ultimate reality. We will discuss this more hopefully later in this lecture. In relating this scene at Jeddah Grove to Black experience and ritual, I reference my encounter with the third chapter of Rima Vasily-Flat's excellent book, which I've worn off the cover now, Black Buddhist and the Black Radical Tradition, the practice of stillness in the movement for liberation. She was also one of my teachers at Union Theological Seminary, and I did a course with her titled The Dharma of Audre Lorde and James Baldwin, and it was an incredible class. And she quotes from in her book Black Buddhist, and she quotes in chapter 3 titled Honoring Ancestors in Black Buddhist Practice, Rituals of Devotion and Resilience. She opens with a quote from Rachel Bagby. And Bagby is a very important author. She wrote a book called Daughterhood, Sounding Hidden Truths. And it's a beautiful book. And the quote is, "To be deeply of a place and of a people means knowing their seasons and languages, speaking their tongues, singing their music, of growing things, knowing and loving their names." I just love that. And when I think of this setting at the Jeddah Grove, I think of these bhikkhus and the Buddha and Subhuti being there, united in the Dharma for all sentient beings in the most profound way. Rima then goes on, opening the chapter with, ancestors venerated in Black Buddhist practice are upheld as those who embody courageous responses to suffering. In their capacity to meet patriarchal white supremacy with resilience while they are alive, Black ancestors demonstrated fortitude, perseverance, and embodied inspiration. As interviews with Black Buddhist practitioners attest, it is a central aspect of their practice to honor ancestors with devotional rituals. For many, venerating ancestors is one part of the three jewels: Sangha, a sense of belonging; connection, family, community. African-descended ancestors embraced by Black Buddhists celebrated, rather than denigrated, the dark-skinned body. They furthermore embraced African cultural expressions, including ritualized traditions and customs such as healing practices, song, and dance. And so when I read this, I hope and I dream I will go back to another reason why I'm here, and it's partially, George Floyd and what was going on then. And, we as a country got to witness murder, and we couldn't get away from it. And to a lot of us, this was revelatory, but to those of us in the Black community who are like, yeah, right, and now you know what we've always known. But more than that, there was a train kind of leaving the station, and I felt that I was not on it. And so my personal story is also grounded in why I'm here. When I came to White Lotus 7 years ago, 7 years ago, it was out of a need, and it has grown into an existence rather than a need. It is who I am. And that need, having taken my Bodhisattva vows and also my Genyin vows, is to remain until all sentient beings are free from suffering, or free from suffering. So how, I'm a Black man, there is no way around that. But I don't seek just to liberate Black people. That's not part of my Bodhisattva path. Part of my Bodhisattva path is education and liberating all beings, and that means making people aware of me, seeing me and seeing others. So, I already mentioned my own experience with ritual. Another part of ritual, my mother was a smoker, and I always felt a sense of safety when she was sometimes in the dark and there was a lit cigarette and the smoke going on, and you're like, we're safe. I'm at home. And so ritual can work in so many ways, and that's what we have in this opening. We have this place where Dharma is being espoused. Think of the sacrifices of the bhikkhus in their lives to make it possible for them to follow the Buddha. Some of them leaving, wealth in order to just travel and learn the Dharma. I go on with, American culture has a problem with veneration. The odor of subservience is unpleasant and uncomfortable for the American psyche. For a lot of Americans, ritual has been replaced by survival mode. Of foremost concern to me as a Buddhist and as a Black man is not only the decline and inability to embrace ritual as part of a meaningful life, but how to empower and educate future generations towards not just embracing and discovering the rituals of their ancestors, but also creating and embodying unique and purposeful ritual in their lives. Before leaving this conversation, I would like to read a quote from book 13, chapter 13 of the book, African Wisdom, New Voices. Another great book. This book actually just came out, and we can talk later. I'll send out a bibliography of books if anyone's interested. And now, my brain is all over the floor.
We need an attendant for you.
Okay. So in chapter 13 of this book, African Wisdom, New Voices Talk Black Liberation, Buddhism, and Beyond, this chapter was written by Reverend Seiho Mudo Morris, and she's an ordained Zen Buddhist monk, and also is a woman in recovery. And she writes, a 12-step approach to clearly seeing and addressing the experience of cultural bias, racism, and other isms that we as persons of African descent and Black indigenous people of color experience. And she writes, long ago, the same Zen master, Dogen Kigan, wrote a summation of an insight. He wrote, to study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be awakened by all things. To be awakened by all things is to remove the barrier between self and other. And then she writes, for me, it has evolved over the years. We're talking about interpretation now. Over the years, especially with regard to culture, cultural bias, racism, and otherism. Today, I would restate it as, to study the way is to examine cultural bias, racism, and otherism. To examine cultural bias, racism, and other racism is to remember our ancestors. To remember our ancestors is to meet our generational madness. And this is where I should have put it on an iPad. To meet our generational madness is to heal our individual and collective suffering through the path of anti-racism. And I write at the end, this is the work of ritual. So that's that part of the chapter. So now I'd like to go on about the Bodhisattva. One blesses fearless bodhisattvas with the best of blessings, and it is rare, Bhagavan, how the Tathagata, the Arhat, the fully enlightened one, entrusts fearless bodhisattvas with the greatest of trusts. All of us in this room are bodhisattvas, whether we claim to be or not. whether we follow a particular ideology or not, whether one has taken a vow or not. Helping sentient beings is in our DNA as humans, even in the most twisted and inadvertent of circumstances. Why does the fully enlightened one entrust fearless bodhisattvas with the greatest of trusts? And I want to hear a quote from Chogyam Trungpa. Chogyam Trungpa is an interesting figure in Tibetan Buddhist teaching and bringing it to America. The results of his influence can be seen almost everywhere in this country, and one could give an entire lecture just based on him. But suffices to say that he was a Tibetan Buddhist meditation master and holder of both the Kagyu and Nyingma lineages. And this is from his book, Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism. And this is from a chapter written, The Open Way. The Bodhisattva path starts with generosity and openness, giving and openness, the surrendering process. Openness is not a matter of giving something to someone else, but it means giving up your demand and the basic criteria of the demand. This is the Dana Paramita, the Paramita of generosity. It is learning to trust in the fact that you do not need to secure your ground, learning to trust in your fundamental richness, that you can afford to be open. This is the open way. If you give up your psychological attitude of demand, then basic health begins to evolve, which leads to the next act of the Bodhisattva, the Shila Paramita, the Paramita of morality or discipline. Having opened, having given up everything without reference to the basic criteria of, I am doing this and I am doing that, without reference to oneself, then other situations connected with maintaining ego or collecting becomes irrelevant. This is the ultimate morality, and it intensifies the situation of openness and bravery. You are not afraid of hurting yourself or anyone else because you are completely open. You do not feel uninspired with situations which brings patience. The Kshanti Paramita and is patience, and patience leads to energy. Verva, the quality of delight. There's the tremendous joy of involvement, which is energy, which also brings the panoramic vision of open meditation, the experience of dhyana, openness. You do not regard the situation outside as separate from you because you are so involved with the dance and the play of life. I just love that. It's so fun. He makes being a bodhisattva sound like a hoot. You know, you give up something, you get something. You give up something, you get something. You give up yourself, you get openness. You give this, you know. It is the bodhisattva path, this idea. And this is, again, why the Buddha trusts the bodhisattva with this information. This explanation of bodhisattva is wonderfully descriptive and engaging view of the mindset one aspires to when walking the bodhisattva path. I mentioned the word mind again because it's the sole actor towards liberatory expression. To trace earlier signs of writing about the bodhisattva, I turn to Chandra Kirti, who writes in the first chapter of his Madhyamaka Tavara. Frank, help me out here.
I'm just a parrot.
A school, and that's a school of Buddhist thought that was taught by Nagarjuna, who was one of the great teachers of our Buddhist tradition. He was an Indian monk, very influential in Tibetan Buddhism. And so Chandrakirti writes, and again, giving you a sense of who the Bodhisattva is, who you are, what you're aspiring to. Homage to Manjushri, Kumara, tender, glorious, ever youthful. Everybody wants to be Manjushri. The Shravakas and those halfway to Buddhahood are born from the mighty sage, and Buddhists take their birth from Bodhisattva heroes. Compassion, non-duality, the wish for Buddhahood for others, sake, are causes of the children of the conqueror. Oh man, you can't eat that old stuff, right? A Buddhahood's abundant crop, compassion is the seed. It is like moisture bringing increase, and it is said to ripen in the state of lasting happiness. Therefore, to begin, I celebrate compassion. Beings think I at first and cling to self. They think of mine and are attached to things. They thus turn helplessly as buckets on a water wheel. And to compassion for such beings, I bow down. Through dedication with Samantabhadra's prayer, footnote, that's something, the prayer of Samantabhadra is something we do quite often here, and maybe I can get Frank to say something at the end of my lecture about that. Samantabhadra. They rest in perfect joy, the first of all the grounds, and henceforth gaining this, they take the name of Bodhisattva and are thus renowned. We all, as Bodhisattvas, take the vow of Samantabhadra, which is quite lengthy. For they are born the offspring of the Tathagatas. 3 fetters they have utterly forsworn, fulfilled in supreme joy. These bodhisattvas have the power to shake 100 worlds. From ground to ground they stride, their steps lead ever higher. All paths to lower realms have now been closed. The states of common beings are no longer theirs, their level likened to the 8th stage of the Aryas. With perfect bodhicitta as their aim, though dwelling on the first, those born from Buddha's speech, they now surpass. Pratyeka Buddhas too. Frank, Pratyeka Buddhas.
They said that they practice like a rhinoceros alone in the forest, that they come to great enlightenment, but they're not involved with other beings. So their ultimate enlightenment is a little bit limited, but nonetheless, very impressive mental accomplishment.
They soar above them by their merits, growing strength, and by their wisdom also went on far progressed. The initial cause of perfect Buddhahood is generosity, which here is now preeminent. With joy, the Bodhisattva gives their very flesh, a sign whereby the unseen is inferred. And this goes on, but I want to give you a flavor for how the Bodhisattva evolved from this kind of writing to Chodgyam Trungpa, who brought these teachings to this country. And later on, I will relate that to both of these to my concepts of a bodhisattva, or how I wish to live as a bodhisattva. At the end of this, I write, I would be remiss and not a true student of the Dharma if I did not mention the essential manual for all on the bodhisattva path. Shantideva's Bodhichara, boy, I'm really tongue-tied today. Bodhichara Yavatavara, The Way of the Bodhisattva, which is an incredible work. And that translates as The Way of the Bodhisattva. And particular eloquence and importance is the dedication section of this work, which I'll just read a couple of paragraphs.
Just I should say, George, this is Dalai Lama's favorite book.
Yes, this is the Dalai Lama's favorite book.
It's considered to be the greatest book on conduct that was written in Sanskrit. So the Tibetans highly, highly revere it.
Oh, there we go. And just a short bit of this so you can get an idea of what it's written. By all the virtue I have now amassed, by composition of this book, which speaks of entry to the Bodhisattva way, may every being tread the path to Buddhahood. May beings everywhere who suffer, torment in their minds and bodies, have by virtue of my merit joy and happiness in boundless measure. As long as they may linger in samsara, may their joy be undiminished. May they taste of unsurpassed beatitude in constant and unbroken continuity. Throughout the spheres and reaches of the world, in hellish states as many as there are, may beings who abide there taste the bliss and peace of Sukhavati. Sukhavati is the pure realm, the realm of Abhidhamma, a kind of Buddhist heaven, if you will. And it goes on for quite a bit. Now, for me, it is wonderful that these are Buddhist writings, and I sit in awe of the fact that at 68 years of age, I am learning something that speaks to a truth. The Buddha's teachings and his writings, they are spiritual and they are religious, but they are secular in essence. There are truths when we talk about Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and Bodhisattva prayers. We're really just talking about human condition. We're talking about everyday life. We're talking about feelings, habits, actions, possibilities that reside in every living being. All right, liberation and the Bodhisattva. Bodhisattvas can be found in unexpected places. In talking about or meditating on the power of the mind and its relationship to Dharma, I'm reminded of the last essay written by J. Masters in his book, Ending Freedom, How Death Row Broke and Opened My Heart. And it is written with an opening by Pema Chodron. Mr. Masters is a death row inmate. I don't know yet if he's been released. There's been movement in that direction, but his teacher, mentor while he was incarcerated, was H.E. Chagdu Tolku Rinpoche. So we're talking about the writing of a man who's on death row, who has been taught the Dharma and considers himself to be a bodhisattva. And so I will quote. This is rather lengthy, but I feel it's important. It's not as lengthy as the book. When I'm asked about the title of my book, Finding Freedom, and how I'm able to obtain such a freedom behind the walls of San Quentin, worse still, on death row, and for all the years I have been here, my mind soars above the question and wonders. Does anybody want to know how badly I want out of prison? Can a practicing Buddhist ever cry foul at the injustice of being here? Or is the purpose of my being here in prison, no matter rightly or wrongly, justly or unjustly, precisely what lies at the heart of the Buddhist teaching? Can a practicing Buddhist cry foul at the injustice of being here? Or is the purpose of my being here in prison lie in the heart of the Buddhist teachings? Freedom can be found in any situation I may be confronted with. True freedom is not about where I am, but rather about the practice of cultivating peace within my heart and mind. Still, I struggle with the question of what real freedom is. I sit with this question in my daily life. Whenever I hear one of my fellow prisoners say that he will never know true freedom until the day he is finally let out of prison, I wonder if embracing the teachings of the Buddha is just another way. I have become institutionalized. Or does choosing not to wait until I'm out of prison to experience freedom translate into, I'm not trying hard to get out of prison? How can I, as a Buddhist practitioner on death row, find freedom in myself without being thought foolish by my fellow prisoners or my own mind? How do I answer the self-imposed questions that run rampant in my mind? What am I doing? Hell, man, freedom isn't being here in prison. Not in prison like this, sitting on folded blankets on this cold-ass floor behind this solid door, dude. Freedom is about going wherever you please, wherever you want to the beach, the theater, being around family and friends again. In prison, we are left alone with the troubled turbulence of our minds. This agitation either becomes fuel for the prison's towering furnace that belches out bitterness, hatred, and resentment, or the mind levitates above or seemingly doomed existence and instead dwells on the real meaning of our lives and the meaning of all life. From the moment I met my teacher, Chabdu Rinpoche, I wanted to learn how to find some measure of inner peace. I did not try to pronounce the Sanskrit words that I read in his books, nor did I try to make sense early on of their meanings. The scholarly aspect of Buddhism were not for me. What I remember more than anything else is Rinpoche's emphasis on practice. His words became an echo in my ears. Practice, and then do more practice. I was given the red tower practice and meditation, a way of seeing through an open door to states of happiness, inner peace, and ultimate freedom. One sits with the pure nature of the mind that chooses true happiness over suffering, and at the same time recognizes that no one is free from suffering. Let me repeat that. Recognizes that no one is free from suffering. I was taking on the Bodhisattva vow. I say how I could compassionately use all my human imperfections, the physical state of my imprisonment, and even the neighbor of the execution chamber as ways to benefit others. If I could practice in such circumstances, perhaps I could give hope to the hopelessness felt in their lives. I learned that Buddhist practice was about awakening to the idea that freedom is not obtained by hurrying to get out of prison. Most prisons aren't in San Quentin or on death row, and they still do not have the inner peace and freedom that they, like me, desire. I began to recognize my own hurt. Okay, it's on the floor somewhere. Well, I have another copy here.
Back up.
But believe it or not, I got jelly on this, so that all the pages are stuck together. Okay. So let me, I begin to recognize that my own hurt okay. That's not it either. No. Okay, I began to recognize that my own hurt and pain and suffering was that of all suffering sentient beings. There was no better place to start this spiritual path than where I was. This does not mean, nor does it today, that I don't aspire to get out of prison and not to be here 1 minute longer than I have to. What it does mean is starting where we are. Whenever we start where we are, real freedom is in our practice. Whatever spiritual practice keeps us awake and close to the true nature of our hearts and minds is where freedom can be found. Often I'm asked by fellow prisoners what I think freedom is all about. I try not to sound too spiritual. I say freedom is about keeping who you really are real with you. When I'm pressed for a more down-to-earth response, I like repeating the words from a song I once heard. It's about freeing your mind and your ass will follow. What I tell myself almost like a mantra is that freedom arises out of practice. The practice of being, whether on San Quentin's death row or lying under a favorite tree in the park, leads to real freedom. Real freedom is the practice of cultivating seeds of peace and the time we give to ourselves that affects not who we are, but the whole world around us. Words of wisdom from a prison. And so I discovered this because of the Diamond Sutra. When one reads Sutra, hopefully one engages with peeling back the layers and asking the questions. What does this mean to my life? What does this relate? How does this relate to my life? What are the correlations? What, even bringing imagination, what do I imagine happens or could happen when I'm thinking like this, when I experience this? Okay, now I have a moment to sort of get myself organized. I'm almost done. Okay. So we talked about a little bit about ritual, and we talked a little bit about liberation. Why are we here? Is being asked in the congregation at Jeddah Grove. Under what circumstances? What is being asked and why? The importance of these rituals, our responsibility and commitment to each other, the earth, and all sentient beings. Now I'm going to do a quick one. Claiming of Jesus as symbolic of the oppressed, all sentient beings as born to suffering. The work and task of helping. What is liberation? There is no true liberation independent of the struggle for freedom in history. History is the imminent character of liberation. It is the project of freedom. The imminence of liberation is visible wherever the emancipation of people from the chains of slavery take place in history. There is no liberation without transformation, that is, without the struggle for freedom in this world. There is no liberation without the commitment of revolutionary action against injustice, slavery, and oppression. Liberation, then, is not merely a thought in my head. It is the social historical movement of people from oppression to freedom. Israelites from Egypt, Black people from American slavery. It is the mind and body in motion responding to the passion and rhythm of divine revelation and affirming that no chain shall hold my humanity down. This is what Black slaves meant when they sang, I'm a child of God with my soul set free, for Christ hath bought my liberty. A similar point is made in Scripture when divine revelation is connected with history, and salvation is defined in political terms. In the Old Testament, salvation is grounded in history and is identical with God's righteousness in delivering the oppressed from political bondage. Can we say caste system here? Salvation is a historical event of rescue. It is God delivering the people from their enemies and bestowing upon Israel new possibilities within the historical context of the existence. This means that humanity's spiritual aims are inseparably connected with the transformation of a society. To be liberated is not simply a status one has, but an action one undertakes as a self-conscious subject. Liberation means, Mammy, don't you cook no more. You're free, you're free. Rooster, don't you crow no more. You're free, you are free. Old hen, don't you lay no more eggs. You are free, you are free. Any view of liberation that fails to take seriously a people's freedom in history is not biblical and is thus unrelated to the one who has called us into being. That's not my writing, that is James Cone, the father of Black liberation theology. How much like Dharma does that sound? So what I'm doing here is creating a bridge between Black theology, Black inherited theology from their white Christian masters and Buddha Dharma. This is important to make because part of what I'm hoping to do, and I've mentioned this to a few people in the Dharma Center, and maybe I'll buy it, maybe I'll see it through, I don't know, but it's to build a Dharma Center in the hood. For me, that would be the ultimate. The Dharma seems to be in every place except where it's needed the most, right where the bullets are flying and people are dying. So it's important to me to draw these correlations, to think of these intersections, and also for me personally to reside in this information. Correlations, similars, references, and comparisons can easily be made from the Buddha's quest after viewing death, old age, and suffering towards finding the antidote to suffering and Black liberation theology and or liberatory ideology that seeks freedom from repression and social justice. My interpretation of Dharma means I bring my whole self to the cushion. The Black man who's experienced in this culture and in a culture that minimizes, exploits, demeans, and seeks to erase a history, not only of toil, struggle, and servitude, think Florida, but also one of excellence, resilience, and creativity. The creation of Black liberation theology was born of the need to ally the God-given Black people as slaves with the struggle's extent at that time. The creative alignment of God and Jesus with the oppressed was not an act of desperation, but a moment of clarity. For what is the use of any theology, liturgy, scripture, or sutra if it's not directed to the liberation of all people? And the Buddha quotes this. He says, I'm here to liberate. You are here to liberate all beings, in that paragraph. One last quote, and then I will talk about what I haven't covered, and take some questions. In her book, Dharma, Color, and Culture, New Voices in Western Buddhism, Ramon Hilda Gutierrez Baldoquin writes, and this is a Hispanic writer writing, when we speak of Buddhism in the United States, we are speaking of a cultural movement that has brought to this continent ancient Indian, East and Southeast Asian and Tibetan spiritual teachings and practices. For the first time in history, these teachings have arrived in a land that is racially heterogeneous. At the same time, they are taking root in a society that was founded by a white majority on the unwholesome seeds of colonialism, genocide, and slavery. In this meeting, the values of community, interdependence, and collaboration come face to face with the values of the pursuit of individualism, self-interest, and competition. We did talk about that. Deep bow meets handshake. The cultural encounter is not only East meeting West, it is the spiritual encounter of heart meeting mind. Today, we are able to speak of the Dharma due to the generosity and compassion of an ordinary man who woke up. When Shakyamuni Buddha set the wheel of the Dharma rolling, he was not giving us instruction for the modern day highly acclaimed practice of self-improvement. When the Buddha spoke to the ascetics who had previously practiced with him, he offered the teachings of liberation itself. In the ancient tradition of the healer administering to the sick, the Buddha gave us a diagnosis and a prescription. He identified the disease and its cause, gave us a pronouncement on whether it can be cured, and a prescription for the medicine. When people from groups who have historically found themselves socially, economically, and politically outside the margins hear that the Buddha taught liberation, nothing more needs to be said. There is no need to proselytize or seduce. All our lives we thirst for freedom, and when we recognize the path that will lead us there, our hearts validate that recognition. To wake up is the task at hand. Not wishing that our lives are better nor different, we wake up to the reality of our lives just as they are. To see this reality clearly, this is the first step to freedom. Such is the significance significance of the Four Noble Truths to the racially and culturally excluded people living today in the United States. Teachings of liberation heard clearly and of culture driven by ignorance, fear, anger, and hate is like the breaking of chains after centuries of subjugation. This is the gift the Buddha Shakyamuni gave us. There's more, but I'm going to end there. I will end, and that's basically just a few sentences. And just a few sentences led me to all of this and other materials I have not read here, which are mostly of my own writing, because I can't write a paper mostly made of quotes. I end this in Cone, my own writing. In Cone, we read, there is no liberation without transformation, and that this means that humanity's spiritual aims are inseparably connected with the transformation of a society. And Hilda Gutierrez Baldoquin's particularly practically roars the admonition to wake up to the task at hand. But the Buddha is thinking far beyond worldly liberation. For he then asks, yet when this innumerable, immeasurable, infinite number of beings has become liberated, we do not in truth think that a single being has been liberated. Not at all. As you're smiling at me. So I would be remiss if I did not mention the part of the sutra that is most quoted and most read. And there are 3 different versions of it, and it probably would be a good topic for discussion before or during questions or whatever. I kind of preface it with, it's life's illusion, I recall. I really don't know life at all. Or row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Merrily, 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 life is but a dream. And the red pine reading of the end of the sutra is, as a lamp, a cataract, a star in space, an illusion, a dewdrop, a bubble, a dream, a cloud, a flash of lightning, view all created things like this. Thich Nhat Hanh's interpretation is, all composed things are like a dream, a phantom, a drop of dew, a flash of lightning. This is how to meditate on them. This is how to observe them. And another interpretation, which is actually my favorite. SpaghettiOs. Last page. Well, all conditioned phenomena are like dreams, illusions, bubbles, or shadows. This is how and I think the ending, this is how all preconditioned phenomena should be realized. Thank you so much for putting up with my rambling. As you can see, there's a lot here, and I'm in the process of tying it all together. But thank you for being subjecting yourself to my meanderings and wanderings, and I hope that at least some of it proved to be a cogent whole and something that we can all take away from here and ponder. Maybe some of it is new, maybe some of it is not. So thank you again, and thank you to those online.
Thank you, George.
May any faults such as non sequiturs, as we say, they are all my own and are not the doing of the Buddha, my illustrious Sangha members, etc. Questions? What time is it, by the way?
8:30. We're fine.
Whoa.
We're fine.
I think I want to read about at least three of the books that you suggested. Will we be able to get a list of books that you think
I
are
will,
fantastic?
you know what I will do is I'll create a list and maybe we can post it on the website. Okay, or I can certainly post it on my Facebook page and people can feel free to take it from there. But, I should have brought my bibliography page, but I didn't because I think I had enough paper here.
You know, what's wonderful, George, is it's something, because I mean, Buddhism is foreign to us all, it's just not, there's no cultural support really there. Although when you study the great figures, it's obviously universal things that are there, but we kind of lack the language. But what strikes me is when you have something that is fundamentally true to each of us, to the nature of each one of us, for that matter, to the nature of the earthworms, it permeates in so many different ways. And what's wonderful is that it's perfect for whatever one's life situation is or has been. This is a remarkable thing. I mean, I'm always struck, they're my own kind of struggle and discovery, the great differences in culture. If you have, the Chinese culture and their whole world, and then you have the Indian culture, I mean, good grief, some linguist said no two languages are farther apart than Chinese and Sanskrit. And when you read the Buddhist texts, like the commentaries, you'll have in the Indian way these just flowing kind of beautiful prose describing some Buddhist concept, some human concept. And in Chinese literature, you have the same concept, but it'll be this pithy thing that's like 6 syllables, like a haiku, like that, as the Japanese do. And what strikes me is that somehow they have kept it together, these teachings, 2,600 years, they haven't gone completely off the rails. Whereas, we see in our own time, people are just really hot and bothered about one thing, and 10 years later, they're 180 degrees different.
Right.
So how do you maintain something stable in the midst of a world where everything is impermanent and changing all the time? So it's an undiscovered but really great, I think the greatest cultural example that we have. And if you look at the Tibetan people themselves, just to take one culture, they were the warriors of Central Asia. Buddhism came to Tibet because they conquered China, and the emperor of China gave his daughter, who was Buddhist, to the Tibetan emperor as a wife, and she brought the first Buddha figure with her, which is in Lhasa. We went to see it a few years ago. You can see a particular dance practice, for instance, in Nepal, which is the same lineage that exists in Tibet, exists in Nepal. They both came from India, but completely absorbed by their respective cultures. In Nepal, it's this beautiful, feminine, flowing kind of dance. The very same tradition in Tibet is this martial stomp. Because, Genghis Khan's grandson tried to conquer Tibet. And the Tibetans talked him out of it, if you can imagine. He said, okay, you can control our foreign policy. We get to keep our domestic policy. And wherever the Mongols conquered, all the way to practically to Austria, what's called Tibetan Buddhism spread. We don't know that. We think of, Shangri-La and this unbelievable, inaccessible place. But it's so completely human. I think too of the Buddha, after his great enlightenment, he hesitated to teach because he just said the truth is subtle and people are just great at screwing it up. And yet he said that he was pressed by the great gods of ancient India. No, please teach, because there are people who will benefit, so you must try. And I always get kind of a chuckle out of it because 7 weeks he stayed around that tree under which he had sat for his great enlightenment. And the first he thought he'd seek out his former students who had abandoned him. They thought he had given up the ascetic path, and he knew psychically that they were like 100 miles away in Varanasi, and so he started walking there. First person he met was a like a wandering monk yogi type, obviously a spiritual person. And the monk said to him, "Gee, you seem kind of clear-sighted and kind of a dignity. What's going on here?" And he addressed him in a certain familiar way and said, "You can't do that because I've come to full enlightenment, and I would actually be your teacher." And he said, "If you say so," and he walked away. So he bumped into the Buddha, but he wasn't moved in any way. It's the world we live in, you know. So for you to come out of your experience and with something which seemingly on the surface it isn't, but esoteric and profound as the Diamond Sutra, to have the first book published, you know, printed in human history, and somehow that means something in the South Bronx. This is something highly inspiring.
Thank you very much. And this is kind of what I view as necessary work. For one of my papers, I did a version of the Vajrapani sadhana for street kids. And I took the idea of this wrathful deity. I called him a fierce deity because you don't want to use the word wrathful in the hood. That won't sit well. But these fierce deities who are, you know, look like, you know, something out of a horror movie. You know, they're crushing skulls and drinking blood and all of this. And what are they? There are emotions. There are feelings. There are insecurities. These deities are crushing our fear, helping us to crush our fear and manage our fear. And so, you know, we live in a superhero culture, right? You know, you've got Iron Man and Spider-Man and Batman. Why can't you have Vajrapani? and so, you know, it seems silly, but communication is meeting people where they are, not where you want them to be. You know, and you know, as a teacher, and then I have my wife and one of my colleagues here, you know, I want my students to know now what took me 68 years to figure out. You have to know this stuff now. And so there's this urgency with which we teach and the frustration we have when they don't get it. And I think the Dharma can be the same way. I think for me, Buddhism, even as a secular and religious residents of this country, is still relatively young. And with Nichiren Shoshu Buddhism being the most populated in terms of numbers, simply because it asks the least of its followers. You know, chant Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. I'm simplifying it, but chant Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, and you know, all will be well. And while of course it goes further than that, the study of the sutra is not quite as intense, or Tantra and Sutra is not inlaid in their Dharma practice. So for me, the complication is a challenge. And I think for most people, you know, we sit on the subway, we do Sudoku, we do a crossword puzzle, we do these things. We sometimes like challenges. And so why can't we challenge our mind? Why don't we challenge our lives in exactly the same way as puzzles to be, and layers to be pulled back, things to be solved, not constantly being in reactive mode. But taking a second, this is what meditation, taking a second, not to relax, but to actually know what's going on in one's mind. I mean, when I teach meditation, when I talk about meditation, I love handing out the book, The Monkey is the Messenger. Because, you know, I get, I was never good at meditation, you know, my mind is so big. that's exactly what you're supposed to notice. And I remember I was in a halfway house and I was teaching meditation, and I had people sitting at the end of their chairs, and there was this big Puerto Rican guy in the back, and he had his arms crossed, and he was looking at me, and I was like, I'm not going to do this stuff. And he was challenging me. And I looked at him, I said, do you know you're meditating right now? He just burst out laughing. Because this idea that it takes some sort of supernatural effort to gain entree to the one thing you might actually have some control of with the right tools. And so making these relationships, there's a whole body of Black Buddhist thought that's out now, and I'm a member of White Lotus Sangha. This is where I reside. This is where I will remain. But it doesn't mean that my antenna will not, should not be broader, and that I should not steal from Zen, and that I should not steal from the Theravada, and that I should not steal, anything. I will use any tool necessary to help sentient beings realize their potential. And this is the beginning of that process. Yeah.
So you just mentioned stealing from different, maybe you should say liberating them.
Liberating them. Thank you. I'm trying to improve my vocabulary. My thinking on the fly is not so. It's funny. I'm the type. If this were a talk about anything pertaining to the viola, we could go on for 3 hours. I would not need a note of paper. So this is all new territory for me. Trying to be a scholar.
George, your talk was really wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. So if there are no more questions, shall we have a dedication of
Sure.
merit?
Sure.
Yes.
Why don't we do the short dedication on page 27, and then we can jump to page 32, but 27 first. By the merit I have accumulated, may I overcome all erroneous attitudes and reach the omniscient state. May all sentient beings who are suffering in the waves of birth, old age, illness, and death be freed from the ocean of samsara. Bodhicitta, the excellent and precious mind, where it is unborn, may it arise. Where it is born, may it not decline, but ever increase higher and higher. May the teachings of the great Drikungpa Ratnashri, who is omniscient, Lord of the Dharma, Master of interdependence, continue and increase through study, practice, contemplation, and meditation until the end of samsara. On page 32. This mantra is the great mantra of Tibet. The 6 syllables refer to the 6 kind of existences that we can have, both in an inner way, but also in an outer way, animals, hungry ghosts, hellish beings, human beings, and etc. Om mani me me hungry. 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 Om mani me Ge wa de ne du na, chen re zi guang ru ju shi, zhuo wa ji kyang ma lu pa, de yi sa la go par shou. Thank you again. Thank you, George. Thank you.
So what I didn't mention and what's going to be in the paper, non-attachment and impermanence,
Oh.
conventional and ultimate reality, and generosity, all stemming from just the first chapter of the sutra. So that's work yet to be done.
There we go. Yeah, good luck.
Thank you.
Let's hope they give you the degree, right?